In this video, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland. So we have glands, and we better start by defining what a gland is. Okay, not very many people have a clear-cut definition for what a gland is. And people use this word quite widely, sometimes very specifically in research articles, and then sometimes very vaguely, like the liver is a gland. The glands of our body make this or that. And it's very important to have a real firm definition of gland, so that when you're reading a research article or in a discussion, you can quickly convert the word gland to give it more meaning and make sense of how the author is intending to use the word. So, a gland is one or more cells that make or makes and secrete or secretes a particular product. So one or more cells that make and secrete a particular product. By this definition, virtually any cell in the body can be considered a gland. Likewise, tissues, two or more cells, when they get together with a common or related function, can be considered a gland. And even organs, like the liver, can be considered a gland. And when somebody considers the liver as a gland, they're thinking of groups of multiple cells that are making and secreting a product. Now, the liver, for example, is both an endocrine and exocrine gland. So let's get a little further into the definitions, and let's begin with an exocrine gland. An exocrine gland is one or more cells that make and secrete a particular product. After all, it is a gland. Okay, one or more cells that make and secrete a particular product. But exocrine glands, exo outside, they're going to secrete that product onto an epithelial surface. Now, some of you might have learned these as the glands with ducts, and then endocrine glands as the ductless glands. And I don't like that definition very much. And the reason why is not all exocrine glands use a duct. By definition, the strictest definition, it is exocrine if it's secreting its product onto an epithelial surface. And a good example of this would be the mucosa and goblet cells. Goblet cells are these cells that are kind of shaped like a goblet or a wine glass. And they fill with product, and they secrete this product, this mucin, that combines with water to form mucus. But really, they're secreting these products onto an epithelial surface. But there is no duct there that they're secreting through. Now, another example of an exocrine gland might be something like the parotid gland. And the parotid gland, kind of the neck region near the masseter, near the mastoid process, it sends its collection of cells, one or more cells, and it makes saliva and sends all that saliva through a duct, the parotid duct, that then pierces the buccinator muscle, on our cheek, and secretes all that product onto the inside of our mouth. Okay, this is actually a very cool muscle because when we chew, when food pushes against it, proprioception pushes that food, that cheek, and pushes that food back to line it up over our teeth. But when buccinator gets stimulated during chewing, it also pinches that duct and basically milks that duct. I may have talked about that earlier in the class this year, because when my father was in the hospital, because of his dehydration, his saliva built up calcium deposits or mineral deposits, and his neck swelled because of this gland. And it basically plugged that duct. And the suggestion I made to him was to rub the inside of his mouth with his tongue to open and close his mouth, to blow up his cheeks and then suck them in, to kind of try to free those minerals. And within the next few days, his swelling went way down. One or more cells that make and secrete a product onto an epithelial surface, one or more cells that make and secrete a particular product onto an epithelial surface through a duct. So I'm going to add usually through a duct. Okay, but the chapter that we're going to be working on is a little bit more concerned with endocrine glands. And endocrine glands are still glands. There are one or more cells that make and secrete a particular product. One or more cells that make and secrete a particular product. But these don't secrete it onto an epithelial surface. These secrete it into the extracellular space, or we could say the surrounding fluid, the extracellular fluid. And after getting into the extracellular fluid, it's taken up by the lymphatic system or by the blood. And these can travel long distances, these products, to do some signaling. Where exocrine secretion is more like sweat and saliva, less so signaling molecules. The endocrine secretions, hormones, which we'll talk about in a couple videos, are signaling molecules that travel long distance. But for all intents and purposes, we could say eventually into the blood. And these are ductless glands. They don't have ducts like some of the exocrine glands. So, for example, I talked about the liver earlier. The liver makes proteins and even some signaling molecules that these cells produce. And when these cells produce those molecules, for example, tensinogen. These products end up into the extracellular fluid around that cell. And when those proteins or signaling molecules or enzymes in the case, well, it's actually a zymogen in the case of angiotensinogen, these products are going to make their way into the bloodstream. So here are some epithelial cells of a passing blood vessel, and through the little gaps in this epithelial layer, it makes it into the bloodstream. Okay, so that's an example of endocrine function of the liver. The liver also makes bile, and through the left, the right, from the caudate lobe and the quadrate lobe, through the common hepatic duct, that bile, through a duct from liver cells, makes its way into the common hepatic duct that joins with a cystic duct that can fill the gallbladder with bile. And then when we eat a fatty meal, and actually a hormone called cholecystokinin is released, it causes smooth muscle to contract, and this bile gets ejected. And as well as the bile produced by these cells of the liver, it's going to make its way through the common bile duct and into the small intestine. So in this case, the liver also has some exocrine function. The pancreas is another example. The pancreas not only has ductal cells and groups of cells that make exocrine products, and dumps them into the main pancreatic duct that either becomes an accessory pancreatic duct or remains the main pancreatic duct to dump its contents into the second part of the duodenum by joining up actually with that common bile duct coming down. We'll get into the second part of the small intestine through all that Star Wars anatomy, really the major duodenal papilla with its ampulla, vater, and sphincter of Oddi. Okay. These ductal cells are going to produce digestive enzymes, really zymogens again. Things like procarboxypeptidase, trypsinogen, chymotrypsinogen. You don't need to worry about the hormones I'm talking about right now. We learn later about angiotensinogen. We learn later about some of these digestive enzymes and bile. But the key thing is that these cells are putting these products into this duct, including some bicarbonate. But we also have islands of cells, the islets of Langerhans, with alpha, beta, delta cells. And these cells are going to secrete their products we'll learn later, insulin, glucagon, and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. And it's going to end up into the blood supply or blood vessel through little gaps in the epithelium or into the lymphatic system. And these products are making their way directly into the blood. So the pancreas, much like the liver, has both endocrine function and exocrine function. The endocrine system is quite widespread. If we consider it by a gland's strictest definition, almost all cells can secrete products, and many of those products can end up into the bloodstream. Now, I'll talk more about what strictly makes a hormone versus an autocrine versus a paracrine. But the lines aren't clear cut between all these products. Some could be enzymes, and it's hard to discern whether we consider them an endocrine hormone or not, and it's really a matter of opinion. And there's a lot of disagreement, or not necessarily disagreement, but just different ways of talking about it. What category what falls into. But if you know each individual product and its process of getting to its destination and what it does, all the banter back and forth about whether autocrine or paracrine should be included with the endocrine system or not, whether enzymes should be considered hormones or not, whether they're doing any signaling or not, and what's the receptor and what's the ligand, it really all goes away. So don't get too bogged down if we mix in a little bit of exocrine with endocrine, provided that you know these strict definitions for each, and then you can understand the perspective that somebody's coming to the conversation with.